The bottle had become his only honest companion in a world that had forgotten his name. Ezekiel Hart sat on the rotting porch of what once was the finest ranch in Dead Horse Flats, watching the sun bleed across a sky that mirrored his shame. The whiskey burned less than the memory of who he used to be, a man whose word meant something, whose land fed families, whose presence commanded respect. Now the wind carried only dust and the echo of his failures through empty corrals where prize horses once grazed. The silence was so complete it felt like a living thing, pressing against his chest with the weight of all his broken promises. Even the coyotes had stopped howling here, as if sensing that this place had become a graveyard for dreams. The morning sun found Ezekiel Hart exactly where it had left him 12 hours before, slumped against the weathered fence post that marked the boundary between his property and the endless wasteland beyond. His fingers still clutched an empty bottle, its glass surface reflecting the harsh light like a mirror of his shattered soul. The whiskey had long since stopped numbing the pain. Now it only served as a liquid reminder of how far he had fallen from the man who once commanded respect across 3 counties. His clothes, once pressed and proud, hung on his frame like burial shrouds, stained with the evidence of countless nights spent drowning in his own despair. The ranch that had been his grandfather's legacy, his father's pride, and his own crowning achievement now stood as a monument to failure, its buildings sagging under the weight of neglect and broken dreams. Each board that had warped, each fence that had fallen, each field that had returned to dust seemed to whisper his name in accusation. The wind carried the scent of sage and regret across the barren landscape, stirring memories that cut deeper than any physical wound. He remembered the day Martha had walked away, her suitcase in one hand and their wedding ring in the other, her eyes holding a sadness that spoke of love finally surrendered to reality. She had begged him to stop, pleaded with him to choose her over the bottle, but the demons that lived in the amber liquid had already claimed his soul. The drought had taken his crops, the bank had taken his cattle, and his pride had taken everything else, leaving him with nothing but the hollow echo of what he used to be. The neighbors who once sought his counsel now crossed the street to avoid his gaze, their children warned to stay away from the broken man who lived among the ghosts of his former glory. Even the preacher had stopped coming, his prayers apparently insufficient to reach a man who had fallen so far from grace. The sun climbed higher, its merciless heat beginning to bake the earth and everything upon it, including the remnants of Ezekiel's dignity. His throat burned with thirst, but not for water, never for water anymore. The bottle beside him mocked his weakness with its emptiness, a glass testament to another night lost to the liquid salvation that saved nothing and damned everything. His hands shook as he tried to stand, his body protesting the movement after hours of motionless despair. The world tilted dangerously, and he gripped the fence post with white knuckles, fighting to maintain his balance in a life that had long since lost all equilibrium. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled overhead, its cry piercing the silence like a judgment from heaven itself. The sound reminded him of better days when such birds had been a welcome sight, promising good hunting and abundant game for the table he once shared with a woman who loved him. His boots crunched against the dry earth as he stumbled toward the house, each step a monumental effort that required more strength than he possessed. The porch steps groaned under his weight, their wood as brittle and broken as his spirit, threatening to collapse beneath the burden of his shame. The front door hung askew on its hinges, a fitting entrance to a home that had become a mausoleum of memories too painful to face. Inside, dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that penetrated the cracked windows, illuminating the decay that had claimed every corner of his existence. Empty bottles stood like soldiers in formation across every surface, their labels faded but their purpose clear, each one a small death, a tiny surrender in his war against reality. The photographs on the mantel had been turned face down, long ago, their smiling faces too accusatory to bear, their happiness a reminder of everything he had destroyed with his own hands. The kitchen sink overflowed with dishes that had been dirty for weeks, their surfaces crusted with the remnants of meals he barely remembered eating. The refrigerator hummed with mechanical persistence, its interior containing nothing but condiments and the ghost of better times when it had been filled with the fruits of honest labor and shared love. He opened cabinet after cabinet, searching for salvation in the form of another bottle, his hands trembling with the desperate need that had become his only constant companion. Each empty space mocked him, each bare shelf a testament to how thoroughly he had consumed not just his liquor, but his very life. The clock on the wall had stopped working months ago, its hands frozen at 3:17, though whether morning or afternoon no longer mattered in a world where time had lost all meaning. The silence pressed against him like a physical weight, broken only by the sound of his own ragged breathing and the distant whisper of wind through broken windows. As the day wore on, Ezekiel found himself drawn to the barn, that cathedral of his former prosperity where prize-winning horses had once stamped and snorted with life and vigor. Now it stood empty, except for the ghosts of better days, its stalls filled with nothing but shadows and the lingering scent of hay that had long since turned to dust. The wooden beams that had once seemed so solid and permanent now sagged with age and neglect, their strength sapped by the same forces that had claimed his own. He leaned against the doorframe, his body too weak to support itself without assistance, and gazed into the darkness that had swallowed his dreams. Somewhere in the depths of that cavernous space, he thought he heard a sound, a rustling that spoke of life where none should exist, a whisper of movement that made his alcohol-clouded mind wonder if he had finally begun to hallucinate the company he so desperately craved. The sound came again, soft as a prayer, but distinct enough to pierce through the fog of Ezekiel's intoxication. A rustling that spoke of something alive moving through the hay-strewn darkness of his abandoned barn. His bloodshot eyes strained to penetrate the shadows, his mind struggling to separate reality from the phantoms that had begun to populate his lonely world. For a moment, he wondered if death had finally come to claim him, arriving not as the grim reaper of legend, but as a gentle whisper in the place where his dreams had once lived. The barn had always been his sanctuary, the heart of an operation that had made him the envy of every rancher, from here to San Antonio. And now it seemed fitting that whatever remained of his life should make its final stand in this cathedral of his former glory. His hand reached instinctively for the bottle that was no longer there, his fingers grasping at empty air as he tried to summon the courage to investigate the source of the disturbance. The afternoon light filtered through gaps in the weathered boards, creating patterns of gold and shadow that danced across the floor like memories of better days. He took a tentative step forward, his boots echoing in the vast emptiness with a hollow sound that seemed to mock the confident stride he had once possessed. The smell of old hay and leather still lingered in the air, mixed now with the mustiness of abandonment and the faint scent of something else, something that didn't belong in this graveyard of his ambitions. His heart hammered against his ribs with a rhythm that had nothing to do with the alcohol coursing through his veins, and everything to do with the primal fear of a man who had lost everything, discovering that he might lose even more. Each step carried him deeper into the shadows, deeper into a confrontation with whatever force had chosen to inhabit the ruins of his life. The silence stretched between the sounds, pregnant with possibility and heavy with the weight of his own expectations. When the rustling came again, it was accompanied by something that made his blood run cold, the unmistakable sound of a child's frightened breathing, quick and shallow like that of a cornered animal. The realization hit him like a physical blow, sobering him more effectively than any amount of coffee or cold water ever could. There was a child in his barn, a living, breathing human being who had somehow found their way into his world of self-imposed exile. His mind raced through possibilities, each more troubling than the last. A runaway, perhaps, or someone lost and seeking shelter from the harsh realities of the world beyond his property lines. The protective instinct that had lain dormant for so long stirred within him like a sleeping giant awakening, pushing aside the fog of alcohol and self-pity that had clouded his judgment for months. He moved more carefully now, his steps deliberate and quiet, not wanting to frighten whatever small soul had sought refuge in his domain. The irony was not lost on him that someone might seek safety in a place that had become synonymous with failure and despair, that his barn might offer sanctuary to another when it had provided none for himself. "Hello," he called softly, his voice rusty from disuse and thick with the residue of too many nights spent talking only to bottles and ghosts. The word seemed to hang in the air like a prayer, carrying with it all the loneliness and desperate hope that had accumulated in his chest over the endless months of solitude. The breathing stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself, and he knew with certainty that whoever was hiding in his barn was now aware of his presence. He could feel eyes watching him from the darkness, could sense the tension of a small body, coiled and ready to flee at the first sign of danger. The weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders like a mantle he had forgotten how to wear, reminding him of the man he used to be before the bottle had stolen his strength and the drought had claimed his purpose. For the first time in longer than he could remember, something other than his own pain demanded his attention, and the sensation was both terrifying and oddly liberating. He moved toward the sound with the careful deliberation of a man approaching a wild animal, his hands held out in a gesture of peace that felt foreign after so many months of clenched fists and grasping fingers. The hay crunched beneath his feet with each step, announcing his approach to whatever small creature had chosen his barn as a hiding place. When he finally saw her, crouched behind a pile of mouldering feed sacks like a feral cat ready to bolt, his heart nearly stopped beating altogether. She was perhaps 11 years old, with tangled hair the color of wheat and eyes that held more wariness than any child should possess, her small frame wrapped in clothes that had seen better days and bore the stains of hard travel. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears, but her chin was raised in defiance, her posture speaking of a spirit that refused to be broken, despite whatever circumstances had driven her to seek shelter in his abandoned barn. The sight of her hit him like a revelation, a reminder that there was still innocence in the world, still souls worth protecting, even when his own seemed beyond redemption. "Please, don't hurt me," she whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying a strength that belied her small size and obvious fear. The words cut through him like a blade, sharp and clean, and more sobering than any amount of reality he had faced in recent memory. That this child would assume he meant her harm spoke volumes about the world she had known, about the experiences that had taught her to expect cruelty from the adults who should have protected her. He felt something crack inside his chest, a fissure in the wall of self-pity and despair that had surrounded his heart for so long, allowing a sliver of light to penetrate the darkness that had consumed him. Her eyes never left his face as she spoke, searching for signs of the violence she had obviously learned to expect, and he realized with crushing clarity that he was being measured by standards he had forgotten existed. The responsibility of that gaze, the weight of being seen by someone who still believed the world could be divided into safe and dangerous good and evil, settled on him like a judgment he was not sure he deserved. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions and the weight of two souls recognizing something essential in each other. The shared understanding of abandonment, the mutual recognition of spirits that had been broken by forces beyond their control. She clutched a small bundle to her chest, her possessions apparently few enough to be carried in what looked like a pillowcase tied with string, and he wondered what series of events had brought her to his doorstep. What failures of the adult world had driven her to seek refuge in the ruins of his life? The afternoon light continued to slant through the barn walls, painting them both in shades of gold and shadow, and he realized that this moment would define whatever remained of his existence, that how he responded to this frightened child would determine whether he was truly lost, or whether some part of the man he used to be still survived beneath the wreckage of his pride and the poison of his shame. The morning came with the cruelty of desert light, harsh and unforgiving, streaming through the cracked windows of the farmhouse like accusations made manifest. Ezekiel woke on the kitchen floor, his body aching from the hardwood beneath him, his mouth dry as the dust that had claimed his fields. For a moment in that space between sleep and consciousness, he forgot about the girl, forgot about the promise that hung around his neck like a noose. Then he heard the soft scraping of her bare feet against the floorboards above, and the weight of his word settled on his chest like a stone. He pulled himself upright, his hands trembling not from withdrawal yet, but from the simple terror of accountability. The bottle on the table seemed to mock him, half empty and gleaming amber in the morning light. He had not touched it since Nina's ultimatum, but its presence filled the room like a living thing, breathing and waiting. The girl appeared at the top of the stairs, her small face peering down at him through the railings, her dark eyes measuring his resolve with the precision of a judge weighing evidence. "You kept your word," she said, her voice carrying neither surprise nor praise, only the flat acknowledgement of a fact. She descended the stairs slowly, her hand trailing along the banister, and Ezekiel noticed how she moved, like someone who had learned to make herself small, to take up as little space as possible in a world that had no room for her. When she reached the bottom, she walked to the table and without ceremony picked up the bottle and carried it to the sink. The sound of the whiskey hitting the porcelain was like the breaking of chains, violent and final. Ezekiel watched the amber liquid swirl down the drain, taking with it the last of his liquid courage, the last of his easy escape from the prison of his own making. Nina turned to face him, the empty bottle still in her hands, and for the first time since she had appeared in his barn, she smiled, a small, cautious thing, like the first green shoot pushing through drought-hardened earth. "Now we can start," she said, setting the bottle on the counter with the solemnity of someone placing flowers on a grave. "I know how to make coffee if you got beans, and I can cook eggs if you got chickens." Her practical words cut through the morning air like a blade through silk, revealing the simple truth that life, even broken life, required the mundane rituals of survival. Ezekiel nodded, not trusting his voice, and pointed toward the pantry where a few supplies still lingered from better days. As Nina busied herself with the coffee pot, her small hands working with the efficiency of someone who had learned early that hunger was a patient but relentless enemy, he found himself studying her profile, the determined set of her jaw, the way she held her shoulders straight, despite everything that had tried to break her. In her movements, he saw an echo of the man he used to be, the man who had once believed that hard work and honest intention were enough to hold back the darkness that waited at the edges of every life. The days that followed took on a rhythm as foreign to Ezekiel as a language he had never learned, yet somehow understood in his bones. Nina moved through the farmhouse like a small general surveying a battlefield, cataloguing what could be salvaged and what must be surrendered to time and neglect. She found a broom, with half its bristles gone, and swept the floors with the determination of someone who believed that cleanliness was the first step toward dignity. She discovered a needle and thread in his late wife's sewing basket and mended the tears in the curtains, her small fingers working with a precision that spoke of necessity rather than skill. Ezekiel watched her from the corners of his eyes, afraid that too much attention might spook her, might remind her that she was free to leave whenever the weight of his broken life became too much to bear. But Nina seemed to have no intention of leaving. Instead, she claimed spaces in the house with the quiet authority of someone who had learned to make homes out of nothing. She chose the small room at the end of the hall that had once been meant for the children he and Martha had never had, and she cleaned it with a thoroughness that suggested she intended to stay. On the third day, she found him sitting on the porch, staring out at the fields that had once been his pride and were now monuments to his failure. The irrigation ditches were clogged with tumbleweeds, the soil cracked and lifeless, the fence posts leaning at angles that spoke of surrender. Nina settled beside him on the warped boards, her legs dangling over the edge, too short to reach the ground. "My pa used to say that land don't forget," she said, her voice carrying the weight of inherited wisdom. "He said it just waits, patient-like, for someone to remember what it's for." She picked up a handful of the dusty earth from the flower box beside the porch, letting it run through her fingers like water. "This dirt ain't dead, Mr. Hart. It's just sleeping." Ezekiel turned to look at her, this strange child who spoke of hope as if it were a tangible thing, something that could be planted and watered and coaxed into bloom. "Your pa sounds like he was a wise man," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. "What happened to him?" Nina's face closed like a door slamming shut, and for a moment Ezekiel saw the careful walls she had built around her pain. "Fever took him and Ma both, 3 winters back," she said finally. "That's when they sent me to the widow Morrison's place." She spat into the dust, a gesture so full of contempt that it needed no explanation. The silence that followed was heavy with shared understanding, the recognition that they were both refugees from lives that had promised more than they had delivered. Ezekiel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small cloth pouch, the seeds he had bought the spring before his world had collapsed, when he had still believed in tomorrow. He poured a few into his palm, beans and corn, tomatoes and squash, each one a small miracle of potential wrapped in a shell of possibility. "Reckon we could start small," he said, offering the seeds to Nina. "See if this old dirt remembers how to grow something besides weeds and regret." Nina took the seeds with the reverence of someone receiving communion, and in that moment Ezekiel felt something shift inside his chest. A loosening of the knot that had been choking him for so long he had forgotten what it felt like to breathe freely. The work began before dawn, when the desert air still held the memory of coolness and the sun was nothing more than a promise on the eastern horizon. Nina woke him not with words, but with the sound of her moving through the house, the soft whisper of her feet on the floorboards, the gentle clatter of the coffee pot against the stove. Ezekiel found himself rising without the usual struggle, his body responding to the rhythm she had created. The sense of purpose that had been absent from his life for so long, he had forgotten it was possible. They worked side by side in the small plot behind the house, their hands dark with soil, their backs bent to the ancient task of coaxing life from the earth. Nina proved to be a tireless worker, her small frame deceptive in its strength, her determination unwavering even when the sun climbed high and merciless overhead. She showed him how to read the soil with his fingers, how to feel for the moisture that lay hidden beneath the surface, how to plant the seeds at just the right depth so they could find their way to the light. As the days passed, Ezekiel began to notice changes in himself that went deeper than the absence of whiskey in his blood. His hands, which had shaken with withdrawal and shame, grew steady again as they remembered the feel of honest work. His eyes, which had been clouded with self-pity and regret, began to clear as they focused on the simple miracle of green shoots pushing through the dark earth. Most importantly, his voice, which had been used for nothing but curses and complaints, found new purpose in teaching Nina the names of plants, the secrets of irrigation, the patient art of nurturing growth. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of fire and gold, Nina turned to him with a question that cut straight to the heart of everything they had built together. "Why did you start drinking, Mr. Hart?" she asked, her voice gentle but insistent. "Was it 'cause of your wife?" Ezekiel felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the urge to deflect, to hide behind anger or silence. But something in Nina's eyes, The same steady courage that had allowed her to face down a drunk man twice her size made him want to tell the truth. "Martha and I, we tried for years to have children," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Lost 3 babies before they could draw breath. The last one, it broke something in Martha. She just faded away, like a flower in drought." Nina nodded, her small hand finding his weathered one, her touch light but anchoring. "And then you faded too," she said, not a question but a statement of understanding. "But you ain't faded now, Mr. Hart. You're growing back, just like them seeds we planted." As if summoned by her words, a cool breeze stirred across the desert, carrying with it the scent of rain from distant mountains, the promise of storms that might yet come to break the drought that had claimed so much. Ezekiel squeezed Nina's hand gently, feeling in that simple contact the weight of the promise he had made, not just to stop drinking, but to become the man this brave child believed he could be, a man worthy of the trust she had placed in his broken hands, a man who could tend not just plants, but the fragile hope that had taken root between them in the ruins of his former life.